I'm going to call the Subcommittee on Legislative Process Reform to order. Ms. Schafel, will you take the roll?
Pulowski.
Pulowski present.
Pulowski present. Wolgamott.
Wolgamott present.
Wolgamott present. Daudt.
Present.
Daudt present. Freiberg.
Present.
Freiberg present. Garofalo.
Here.
Garofalo present. Haley.
Present.
Haley present. Lislegard.
Lislegard present.
Lislegard present. Moran.
Present.
Moran present. O'Neill. O'Neill. Pinto.
Pinto present.
Pinto present. Sandsted.
Present.
Sandsted present. O'Neill. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. Representative Wolgamott, do you have a motion for us?
Mr. Chair, I move approval of the minutes of the February 5th, 2021 subcommittee meeting.
Representative Wolgamott moves the minutes of February 5th. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The minutes are approved. Members, I've just got a couple of brief introductory remarks. I want to particularly thank Representative Sandsted, Lislegard, Pinto, Baker in particular. They've been in a rather lengthy meeting over the last 24 hours with the Department of Health. And they've been going over some things that we will be taking a look at today by a proposal by Representative Baker. But certainly the input of Pinto, Lislegard, and Sandsted are involved in this also. I want to thank the governor and the staff who have contributed to our meetings, and particularly to the work that was done over the last couple of days, and particularly Governor Walz for his personal communication with the committee by both text and phone. That has been greatly appreciated by the chair. So we have a new agenda today. I know Representative Daudt has got another meeting coming up. So Representative Daudt, you are first on the agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think members have copies of language of a bill or draft language that, and I'll give the background of the bill. It is marked MG022, I think. And this came to fruition over the summer when I entered into negotiations with the governor's office to try to find some language that would kind of bring an end to the emergency powers. Under this draft, we did not come to ultimately an agreement, but under this draft language, and I would say I think we got close, and I'll point out where I think or as I recall them, where I think the objections were by the governor's office, and I'm not sure if there's somebody on from the governor's office that would want to speak to that, but I'll try to represent it as accurately as I can. This particular draft language would basically end the emergency powers. It would not allow emergency powers to be called for a pandemic in the future. And it would create a section of statute that would give the governor some limited authority to respond to a public health situation like a pandemic. So I hope that the committee members have had a chance to read through this. We don't need to spend a ton of time on this, Mr. Chairman, and basically what I'd like to do is just kind of walk through concepts that I heard as we as a committee put together some, hopefully some language that we can get passed into law that will bring some resolution to the current emergency powers. So, and I'll talk about the concepts that I believe are important and why I think they're important. So I won't go through the entire language. If people have questions about it, we can certainly dig into it a little deeper, but the framework that I mentioned is basically the way that this works. It would require that if the governor issued emergency orders, that those emergency orders would have to be continued by the legislature after a certain period of time. And I think in my language, they're good for 30 days, the governor's orders, and then they would have to be continued by a vote of both bodies of the legislature. Or I think there might be some language in here too about the LCC taking on that role if we're not in session. And that certainly is an option as well. I think it's important, and conceptually speaking, I think that Representative Sandstead has some draft language today as well that has a similar concept in it. I really feel this is important, that the legislature have to take an affirmative action to continue an executive order, not just, to end one. Taking an affirmative action to end one is the status quo situation that we're in now. We have taken, I think, in the House 11 votes to end the emergency powers, and really to no avail. We don't have the ability to vote right now on individual executive orders. I think that ability is important as well. And the reason that I say I think it's important for us to vote to affirmatively continue an executive order after a certain amount of time is that forces the legislature to be involved. It forces the governor to fill the legislature in on the information he's using to make his executive orders and issue those executive orders. It includes the legislature in the process. It'll force the legislature to have hearings on those issues, and then ultimately make a decision. I think that that's really super important because I think the public has an easier ability to communicate with their legislators and to, if they have an issue or tell a story or how it's impacting their personal lives. It's just almost impossible for constituents from all over the state to communicate with just the governor's office. That's why we have a House of Representatives. That's why we have a state Senate. Because it's easier, we only each represent about 40,000 people. It's easier for people to get in contact with us than it is for a governor that represents, 5.6 million people. So those are kind of the underlying concepts of this. I can certainly, stand for any questions, but ultimately I think what I wanted to do was have a conversation about kind of the concepts involved in this. There are also some, I think this language, and it's been a little while since I read through it myself, but there is some language in here that would basically codify some of the governor's executive orders. We took the executive orders out because, as I said, this language was initially drafted back in June, I think June and July, and the executive orders that were in place at that time are different than the ones that are in place now. So we just pulled them out, and conceptually the committee could have a conversation about what should be continued. It was my intent that we would continue things that administratively gave the governor the ability to respond to the emergency power, things like, to the pandemic, things like receiving federal money or dealing with, things that were kind of a result of the earlier emergency powers. So, that's the concept of this language, but the hallmark of it was really that the legislature, either through the LCC if we're not in session or by vote of both bodies of the legislature, would have to vote to continue one of the executive orders. Now, there are some pressure releases here, and I assume we can have the same conversation about Representative Sandstead's language, because I'm not sure exactly what the intent of her language was, but the pressure releases could be, and these are conceptual as well, but if the legislature votes to end an emergency order, the governor could issue another emergency order to that effect. And then the legislature could vote to end that one. And what happens when you do that is you get into a situation where both sides are going to have to convince the public that their position is right. And if they can't do that, if they can't do that based on science and data, it's going to become really obvious that the public won't support one of those two positions, either ending it or continuing it. So those are the sorts of pressure release valves that I think are appropriate, but it is absolutely appropriate for the legislature to have a voice in what's going on. And I think it's actually really needed, because I think our constituents need to have us be their voice in the legislature. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I can go into depth a little further, or we can have some conversation and questions about the concepts involved.
Representative Daudt, I've got at least 3 members on my list. Representative Sandstead is first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Daudt, I'm looking at your draft, and I'm looking at subdivision 3, preservation of certain powers and duties. I think conceptually I understand what you're trying to get at, but I am going to just ask you for the record, are you saying through this bill that it is reasonable to continue certain emergency powers through the pandemic?
I think, Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I don't serve on a lot of committees, so I forget the the procedure.
All right.
I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative. I think we all know, and obviously there are certain things that we need to continue, and those are things like the administrative, dealing with the fiscal ramifications. We've received a bunch of federal money. If we end the emergency powers abruptly, do we lose federal money, or do we lose an opportunity to provide relief to businesses who have been affected by shutdowns and other things? I think those are all things that we have to analyze, and some of those things would need to continue. I think it's difficult. While I do support an abrupt end to the emergency powers, and I've been pretty vocal about this in the past, I know that an abrupt end to the emergency powers isn't really feasible, but I support an abrupt end because I think it would finally force the legislature to take some action on those things that I think you're probably asking about, which is how do we make sure we don't lose federal money, or how do we make sure that the administrative side of unraveling this whole thing can take place? And we know that needs to take place over time. So I'm keenly aware of that, and absolutely willing to have those conversations. And I have said in the past, the reason for my wanting to end it is literally just to force us to have to make those decisions. In fact, I gave a speech on the House floor that I would end this in hopes that, the Senate really couldn't take, at the time I gave the speech, I think the Senate wasn't going to meet for another week. And I had said, my hope is that during that week, this will force us to figure those things out and have hearings and make sure that we address all of those things, because we have to answer those questions. So that's really what this language was intended to do.
Representative Sandstead.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Thank you, Representative Daudt, for that answer. I think it's very important to realize it's more than just federal dollars and how we're dealing with that. Many of the executive orders right now are dealing with help from employees of other states in terms of vaccinations, in terms of maybe mental health services, different things like that. So I think, and we're not going to go into this greatly, but an abrupt end of all emergency powers of the governor would create a situation that the legislature could not deal with in a 24-hour time period. And so I do think that we do need to be involved as a legislature. Your approach, my approach, whatever draft we're looking at, I think is trying to get at that. And so I'm happy to continue working on that together so we can find a path forward. But I just think it's dangerous to think about ending everything abruptly and overnight. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Daudt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I really appreciate that. I'm keenly aware of that. I didn't specifically go through all of the executive orders, frankly, because this language was drafted back in June and July. And I studied the executive orders at that time. I think Representative Haley, who should be on this committee call with us, has looked into the existing executive orders. And I think we feel that there's probably, and there will be a couple, 2, 3, 4 that are going to be controversial and that we're going to stumble over but I think the legislature being involved in that process is really important, because I think it's tougher for somebody to take a vote when they know that their vote actually is going to make a difference, or it's going to change something. So right now, we're sort of making a statement by saying we want to end this. But I want to be clear that statement is made out of frustration, because I can't believe that we're 10 or 11 months into this and we really haven't thought about what does and I did that back in June and kind of got shut down and frustrating with you. But that needs to happen in order to wind this thing down. And we're frustrated. That's why we keep voting to end the emergency powers, because we're frustrated that behind the scenes conversation in a very substantial way has not happened. So I appreciate your willingness to want to work on that, but I do believe it needs to happen quickly.
Representative Sandstead, anything else?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. I think everything that we're talking about right now just goes to demonstrate to the public how incredibly complex this situation is, and how difficult it is to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. And I appreciate the work that you've done. Again, I'm happy to continue working towards a resolution. Your frustration is felt on both sides of the aisle. It's everybody's frustration. I think Minnesotans and people across the US are experiencing COVID fatigue. We are tired and the ramifications are real. And we need to find a way to move forward that is safe, that is reasonable, that can help our businesses get our kids back in school as soon as we can safely, address the mental health needs. It's everybody's frustration, but that is not a partisan issue, and I appreciate that comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Wolgamott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Representative Daudt, I appreciate your work on this and bringing this proposal forward so we can have this conversation today. This is really important. Representative Daudt, I have heard you many times criticize the current situation, criticism saying that the executive branch has too much power in this. But for me, how I'm reading your legislation, I have a concern that we are giving too much power to a small group of individuals. I just sort of see problems with making it so that a group of 12 people, or technically 6, because under your proposal, 6 votes could kill anything. So I'm just wondering why going from someone who has been duly elected with a statewide constituency where my constituents have the opportunity to vote for governor, your constituents have the opportunity to vote for governor. Why is it an improvement to go from that to now this small group of 6 people that could kill anything?
Representative Daudt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative, for the question. I'll remind you that this language was drafted back in June, and I'll also remind you that when this whole thing started in March, I think everybody kind of thought this was going to be a 90-day thing, or I don't think anybody thought we would be a year later still under emergency powers and still wearing masks, and I think it was just we were naive, right? We hadn't been through a pandemic in the past. So this language was drafted in, I think it was June. It might have been the beginning of July. I feel like it was the end of June or beginning of July. In fact, I know it was because it was, I was negotiating with the governor's office right over the 4th of July weekend as well. So if you think about where we were at that time, we weren't in regular session. So this was really designed to deal with a situation, and that's why we chose the LLC or the LCC in this language. I would actually choose the legislature, and conceptually, just so you understand that, we didn't redraft this language. We just brought the ideas forward. I actually think it should be the full legislature that should be involved. But when we're not in session, I'd be willing to have a smaller group make those decisions. But I do feel that it's very important. And just like you said, all of our constituents also voted for the governor. They sure did. Some of them didn't vote for this governor, but whoever they vote for, this governor won, and that's important. But I'll also remind you that you won and I won. And we also have a voice in this. And I think it's time that our constituents feel like they're being heard when they reach out to us and they want us to impact this decision-making process.
Representative Wolgamott.
Thank you, Representative Daudt. So my understanding is that this is kind of a dated version, and you would actually prefer to have the majority of the legislature making these decisions when we're in session, rather than just a handful of senators and legislators. Because I got to tell you, given our current Senate majority and the behavior that I've seen from them, both politically but also personally, holding events and things that go outside of guidelines that has made people sick and cost human life. I'm seriously concerned about 6 senators who my constituents haven't had the chance to vote for or hold accountable. I'm very concerned about them having so much power to kill any proposal that we might have to respond to this pandemic. So thank you for your clarity.
Representative Freiberg.
Representative Wolgamott pretty much asked the same question, so I'll pass.
All right. Representative Haley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the public that's listening and for the committee members, I just briefly wanted to make the point that the legislature did deal with the one issue of federal funds. When you were talking about access to federal money, that had to deal with a federal Medicaid match that we'd been receiving under the CARES Act. The governor or DHS, we allowed DHS some authority to do what they needed to do under EO 2012. And then the legislature passed House File 105, which allowed DHS to continue those certain waivers. So there is not a current issue on the table that we would be risking federal money if the emergency powers went away. I wanted to make that clear. And then I also wanted to comment on Representative Stanstead and other members. What you're asking for was my bill, my proposal from last week that we did not vote on and did not advance forward. That would allow us to deal with individual executive orders one at a time and would allow the ramp down or ramp off to these emergency powers in a fashion that we are required to do as the legislature. So we have an option, and it's up to you to be able to have the courage, frankly, to take a vote and to take that step. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm just checking to see who's next on my list. Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, can you hear me okay?
You could be a little louder, and I don't mean that in another way.
That's well put, Mr. Chairman. No, I want to highlight for members that, it may be difficult for DFL members to want to kind of rein in this authority. It's difficult when you got a governor of your party, right? And you're looking to transfer that authority from the executive branch to the legislative branch. At some point here, this pandemic is going to end. At some point, there's going to be a Republican governor. I hope in my lifetime, right? There's going to be a Republican governor again. And when that happens, I hope that my Republican colleagues remember these conversations and are still in favor of taking this authority and bringing it back to the legislature. The idea of the legislative branch having a positive check-in to validate these actions is neither extreme nor partisan. In fact, other states, if members research the National Conference of State Legislatures to see how other states do it, there's other states that do it in that manner. And so for having the governor have the flexibility to be an emergency responder, to be an executive in charge, of course, we all recognize that. But after 11 months, I hope that members realize that this cannot be the new normal. We can't have the chief executive, and again, these orders have the power of law. Whether they're good or bad or not is really irrelevant. By this point, there should be consent on the actions that the governor is taking, regardless of their party. If you think about it, if there really isn't, after almost a year of actions, if there isn't consensus on the government engaging in these actions, reducing people's personal freedom or individual liberties, regulating commerce in and above the normal law that is in existence, then it probably shouldn't be happening. And right now, I'm really concerned about the long-term consequences. Again, this pandemic's going to wrap up, I think, a lot quicker than people realize right now. The success of the vaccines are just, they're so much better than any of us could have ever hoped for. But that being said, I would hope that people remember this conversation and don't forget about it. It is not, for my DFL colleagues, this is not an attack on Tim Walz or the chief executive. It is a recognition that when this law was created in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, it just wasn't imagined that someone would conceivably have executive powers for a year. So that's just my comments. And Representative Daudt, thanks for bringing this language forward. Again, I hope we don't forget about this conversation as the pandemic wraps up here. Thank you.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a question, I guess, for Leader Daudt, and then perhaps a comment. And Leader Daudt, you were Speaker my first 2 terms, so I give the honorific of leader. And my question for you is, thinking about about when you first proposed this, and if this had been in place in the summer, moving on in the summer, kind of if you could play out how this would have worked. And I guess I'm building a little bit on Representative Wolgamott's expression of concern about the sort of the behavior, both personally and politically, of in the Senate in particular, and then thinking about the spike that we experienced in October, November, and how quickly we saw the data in this committee in the last couple of weeks about how quickly those spikes come. Could you just kind of walk through how you would have envisioned this if your plan had been adopted at that point, how that might have worked over those several months? Thanks.
Representative Daudt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Pinto. Yeah, it's sometimes tough to imagine exactly how it would have worked, but I'll try to do my best. Let's say that this would have passed into law in a special session, maybe in July. That's likely the first one that would have come up. my anticipation is that the legislature would have had hearings and they would have left some of the governor's emergency orders in place, the stuff that would have allowed him to respond to the pandemic. I anticipate that as things moved forward, the governor would have issued emergency orders under the authority given to him under the, to respond to a pandemic that's given to him in this bill. And then those orders would have been in place for up to 30 days. I think the way I had it drafted in here was that the LCC, which is a subset of the legislature, it's the legislative leadership and finance policy committee or finance committee, ways and means committee, that stuff. So it's a smaller group of legislators, but that they would, in that 30-day period, they could have met at any time during that 30-day period. If they strongly didn't agree that something should continue and they took a vote and it did not pass, then it would have, that emergency order would have ended at the conclusion of that meeting. Had we had a spike, we did have a spike in whenever it was, October, obviously the governor would have issued emergency orders at that time, and then the legislature could respond to those. But, we were all seeing the same data at that time, and I think the legislature would have responded in an appropriate way. So I assume that those orders, I don't know if they would have looked the same because I don't know if the governor would have issued the same orders, but I do know one thing is that this language would have required the governor to include those legislators in his decision-making process, and he would have to convince them and the public that what he was doing was the right thing to do. And I think that's a standard too, that we really, that's kind of an unintended consequence of this, where I think we all should have an appreciation that having that incentive for the governor to have to include the legislature and brief us and really give us the data behind why he's making decisions, is a good thing, and that we should incentivize that sort of behavior from the governor. So if the legislature would have ended one of his emergency orders, the governor, if he felt strongly enough, could have reissued that emergency order, and it would have stayed in place until the legislature took another action. So yes, you could get into a little back and forth, but then you have to convince the public that you're right. And if Republican legislators would have been wrong, and the spike and the public sentiment behind the spike, they would not have voted to remove the governor's or end the governor's power. Or end the governor's order, excuse me. So I think that's kind of the way I see it taking place, but that's a scenario that we're not in right now because we are in regular session. So now I would draft the bill to say that when we're in regular session, the entire legislature votes, and then we use our regular committee process to have hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Leader Daudt, I guess because when I think back to October, it feels like we had some evidence of what was happening then, because we did have that data coming out. And I guess my concern is that that was right around the time, and thinking then in early November, as things were really spiking, that we saw those Senate leaders, have their close event without masks. A very close friend of mine, Senator Jerry Ralph, who I worked with really closely in early childhood issues, soon thereafter contracted COVID, and then they didn't tell the other senators that in fact somebody had been infected. And so I feel like we sort of saw in that moment, in fact, how they behaved and what the conduct was. And I guess my fear is that even at that moment, that data was spiking up, yet they still acted the way that they did. I recognize that as the numbers climb and climb and climb, then we do act. But I know we know from around the world, thinking about the region in Italy originally where this came, and then in New York, et cetera, things can get out of control very quickly. So I guess my concern about this, and just to pivot and to finish up the comment then, is that in general, in the legislative process, we have a bias towards inaction. It's very hard to have things happen. In this case, under our current law, the governor does actually have to get approval from an authorization from other statewide officials through the Executive Council, 5 statewide officials. This would pivot to this slightly larger group when we're out of session, and then the legislature as a whole needing to affirmatively act. And I guess what it feels to me, we as a legislature can act on emergency orders, executive orders. This is actually happening right now in our legislature. And I think that that's what Minnesotans really care about is what's happening on the ground, what are the decisions being made to keep people safe. But I think the concern that I have, Leader Daudt, about this proposal is that it tips us in a situation that is so dangerous that we're right now, I know it's 11 months in, but I'll just point out that we are holding this hearing in a way that would have been unimaginable 11 months ago as well, right? I mean, ordinarily I'm in my basement, I happen to be at the state office building right now, and just recognizing that we're in a situation where this would tip to a bias towards inaction, and the legislature can act at any point, but when there is a doubt, when we are in the middle, to say that we do need to be acting in favor of health and safety. So I guess that's the hesitation that I have about kind of the overall orientation to this. But I appreciate you bringing it forward in this discussion because it's really important to have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Daudt, I know you have to leave fairly soon, but do you want to have a final comment?
Yeah, I would like to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Pinto, for those comments. I would remind folks that what we're talking about here is that the legislature, I think, is being accused of 11 months of inaction. And while I understand that perspective, under my scenario or my language, the legislature would not have to meet, the LCC would not have to meet. Their inaction would allow the executive order to go for 30 days, at which point it would need to be extended. If it is not extended, the governor could reissue it the next day. We're talking about really reasonable things here. I'll remind you that right now, everything in the scenario that you just mentioned gives one party absolute control of what's going on. And I do know Representative Garofalo very articulately commented on the fact that it is difficult sometimes to stand up to a governor in your party. This isn't about standing up to the governor. This is just about making sure that your constituents, when they contact your office, can be assured that you actually have an ability to influence public policy. That's, after all, what we're here for. And I'll remind you that the threshold that I'm proposing is so low that you would only need to, or the governor would only need to convince one Republican in the Senate. And if he can't convince one Republican that his ideas are going to keep Minnesota safe and that they should be left in place, I'm sorry, but I just believe that's a threshold that, and I think you're going to see a similar language in Representative Stanstead's bill. I don't think that's the issue, right? I think now people are generally saying, yes, the legislature should have to vote to continue executive orders. And I think that's something that just is a minimum expectation. Without that, you don't end up with the incentives for the legislature to have hearings, for the legislature to, gain the knowledge that's necessary. I mean, look at what happened now we're finding out in New York, where Governor Cuomo has basically covered up and lied about statistical data of deaths in nursing homes in an effort apparently now so that the federal government wouldn't find out about that, right? I mean, the legislature needs to be involved in this process. We are the check and balance, and that's what our Constitution envisions. And right now, the emergency powers that are in place under the current Chapter 12 never envisioned this situation where we would be under emergency powers for 11 months. And right now, there isn't a check or balance on the governor. And I think it's very important that we have that check and balance. And if you need to wonder about how important that is, just look at what's going on in New York State right now, where a governor, they're talking about impeachment now of that governor over lying and covering up deaths in nursing homes because it would have made his policies look bad. And unfortunately, these aren't, a pandemic's not political. A pandemic is really important, and it requires thoughtful leadership from everyone to come together and decide how to keep Minnesotans safe. And all I'm suggesting is that I, as a Republican and as a Minnesotan, I want to be part of that process.
Thank you, Representative Daudt. I know you've got to go, and we appreciate you being here today and look forward to you returning to us. So,
thank you,
Representative Daudt. Okay, Representative Lisagard.
I had a question for Representative Daudt, actually, because I have a real hard time with the comment that you only have to convince the governor only has to convince one person. And if 134 people in the House, we all agreed that we believe that an emergency power needed to stay in place, the governor shouldn't be the one to have to convince one person. I mean, everybody's saying that one person shouldn't have all the power. Now all of a sudden the governor has to only convince one person. you know, we're still losing our voice with Representative Haley's proposal, which I did offer that I would support Representative Haley if you accepted my amendment. And we did speak, and you said yesterday that you can't accept my amendment and your bill will be what it is. And to me, in all due respect, that is disheartening, because I am willing to sign on to your bill if you accept my amendment, where our body, 134 people, isn't relying on the governor having to convince one person. That's the problem that I have with that. So it's really hard for me for everybody to say it's all in one guy's hands or one person's hands, and then that one person has to bypass 134 people, us, who we would believe in something, but then we have to rely on the governor to convince one person. It doesn't make sense to me.
Representative Representative Daudt is still with us, so I'm going to go to Representative Daudt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Luzlegard. And I appreciate that perspective, and I see where you're coming from and what your concern is. However, I caution that we don't kind of make a decision based on the current situation and the current scenario, that we actually think about the way that our Constitution envisioned that the legislature works. And so I can't think of another scenario where the House of Representatives gets to rubber stamp something, regardless of what the Senate does, right? I mean, I think in the real world, we probably all would like to do what Nebraska did and go to a unicameral legislature and just get rid of the Senate, right? But unfortunately, that's not what our Constitution envisions. And it's the legislature that has to react to something, not just one body of the legislature. So I really would caution and think about it through that lens. I know it's tough to separate the kind of emotion of the situation that we're in right now, but the reality is I don't know that there's a constitutional defense for saying that we should have just one body of the legislature be able to endorse something that the governor's doing without the other body having to do it. We don't get to act on our own. I mean, yes, the Senate gets to confirm, and we have some individual powers, but something like this would be, I think, I don't know of another example where something like that would be the case. And the reality is, just like our state, to Representative Wolgamott's point about our state has elected this governor, our state has elected Republicans to be in charge of the Senate, and our state has elected Democrats to be in charge of the House. So we don't just get to pick and choose based on which party's in control of what body. And my statement about, I don't think that the threshold is that high, and it really is true. The governor could, the public could, the data could only have to convince one Republican senator to vote to uphold the governor's emergency order, and it continues, right? The majority of the body gets its way. And so it's not, I didn't mean to imply it's just the governor has to convince, but he does have to share his data with us if he's making an executive order, and explain to us why he's doing that and why he thinks it's important. I think that's his obligation. And I think it's our obligation then to be the check and balance on that. And it's our obligation to do it as the legislature, not just as the House or the Senate. Hopefully that, I do totally understand where you're coming from, and I see it, but I feel like you're a little bit kind of blinded by the emotion of the situation that we're in right now. So I would encourage you to look beyond that. To Representative Garofalo's point, at some point the tables will turn and we'll have a Republican governor, and we'll be in the opposite situation, and the perspective always looks much different. So our job as legislators is to separate ourselves from that and really look at what's the best for our institution of the House, our institution of the legislature, and then our state as the state of Minnesota. And I think we really do have to act as a legislature. I don't know that the Constitution would defend us saying just the House itself could continue that. And I assure you that if 134 members of the House wanted to continue one of the governor's executive orders, I guarantee you there would be one Republican senator that would agree with us, and probably almost all of them. And I think that these executive orders and the emergency powers rise to a level where they should meet a very high standard. And that high standard should be that the legislature should have to continue them after a certain amount of time. But I also do understand the importance of needing to act quickly and the governor needing to do something very quickly based on information when he doesn't have time to wait for the legislature. But then after 30 days, the legislature would have an opportunity to weigh in on that. I think that time period is appropriate. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Blizzard.
No, thank you, Representative Daudt. I'm seeing some of your points, but it's still really, really hard for me. Do you know if it is by constitution or by law that we can't do that, or is that something that House Research could verify that that's possible? Because you brought up a really good point, right? So the governor appoints commissioners. Well, we have no say in any way, shape, or form. The Senate is the ones that confirm. Well, to your argument, then shouldn't we have a say in the House? 134 people, each representing 40,000 people. Shouldn't we have a say in the confirmation? But we don't. Only the Senate does. So is there a way that we could verify if by law, if we could do that or not? It's just a question. I'm not sure.
Representative Daudt. Representative Daudt, you're muted, I think.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Liz Lagarde. I would say that the Constitution does define some specific roles for the Senate and does also define some specific roles for the House. Some of those specific roles for the House of Representatives are that a bill to borrow money or encumber debt, a bonding bill, must originate in the House of Representatives. Also, likewise, a bill to increase revenue, to raise taxes, must originate in the House. So there are examples in our Constitution, and I'm certain that our nonpartisan research could dig up others. There are limited examples where each body has some power. I think it would be, and to your question directly, we can write the statute however we want to. I just think it would be tough to defend, and I don't think that the Constitution backs up an argument to say that one body of the legislature can vote to extend an emergency power or emergency order. I think you'd have to say, it'd be very difficult to say it would be anything but the legislature itself. We can't pass a bill out of the House and have the governor sign it. The Senate can't pass a bill and have the governor sign it. The Senate by itself and the House by itself cannot override a governor's veto. We do that as the legislature. And I think in this scenario, it'd be tough to, and actually, I also think it would look partisan if you were to say, no, we're just gonna, not have the legislature do it, but just have one body that just so happens to right now be in control by Democrats. I think it would look partisan, but I also just don't think that the Constitution really kind of backs that up. So that's my opinion, but we could get that information from House Research too.
Representative Liz Lagarde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's good. Thank you, Mr. Representative Daudt.
Representative Haley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Daudt covered a lot of the points that I wanted to make to clarify Representative Liz Lagarde's questions, but I did want the committee to know that I did draft an amendment and I sent it to Representative Liz Lagarde, and we had a discussion about that. So I followed up on his request that I do that. And the language that I sent him, he said wasn't quite hitting the point that he had tried to make. And he was going to work on some additional language. And I said, I'm open to see it when you can, send it my way. So I wanted to make that point, and I think Representative Daudt has covered the rest of it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Representative Liz Lagarde raised his hand right away, so I'm going to go back to him. I think he wants to respond. Representative Liz Lagarde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to clarify, you did send me language, and that language said when the question, the debate that we had yesterday is that, or last week, that they wouldn't even have to take it up. That is what you included. And then when we spoke, that is not the intent that I meant. You did partial. And then when I said that we needed to include one body, you said that you did not want to take that amendment, and the bill is what it is. I could either accept it or not.
Representative Haley, you want to respond?
I think I can take it offline. We've got a lot of important work to do today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right. Representative Freiberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looks like Leader Daudt may have left, unfortunately, because he was making some sort of quasi-constitutional arguments. I mean, and it seems to me that I think Representative Lislagard has an intriguing idea, and I certainly don't see any constitutional reason we couldn't do it. The process that's set out in Chapter 12 certainly doesn't follow the traditional process of legislation anyway, where there's presentment to the governor and a possibility of veto. It just says, the two houses have the ability to overturn it if they both vote so. So I see Mr. McCormick and Mr. Gehring appear to be on this call. I guess I'm wondering if it would be possible just to ask them if it would be, is there any constitutional barrier to us creating a law that says any executive order can be approved by one chamber of the legislature, and if that's done, as long as that happens, then it stays in effect. I don't think there's a requirement that related to emergency authority that both chambers vote in favor of it. So just wondering if I see Mr. McCormick has turned on.
You see there, Mr. McCormick, you want to respond?
Mr. Chair, Representative Freiberg, I think if the committee comes to a conclusion about how they want to draft legislation, they're going to have to talk a little bit about creating either joint or House and Senate rules to implement the legislation. For example, Minnesota Statute 3.055 requires both bodies to adopt rules to implement another procedural matter that the legislature wanted to move fast on. So at some point, if you decide structurally how you want to go forward, you want a situation like now where both bodies can adopt in different venues, in different formats, in different resolutions, an end to the emergency statute. There's no requirement that they do a joint concurrent. If you want to continue that, that's fine. If you want to make sure that both bodies have an opportunity to vote, then you could require in legislation adoption of rules that would require both bodies to vote. I think you could, hypothetically, you could require both bodies to vote on a resolution, but then create a standard that says if one body says no, then the governor's powers continue. That's essentially the situation we have now. I think you could draft the opposite, requiring both bodies to vote, but if one body says yes, an affirmative support, then the powers continue. You could draft it any one of those ways. I don't see, Matt might want to weigh in, or he might not want to. I don't see necessarily the constitutional issues going to accrue to the question of whether it's a one-body vote or a two-body vote. I also think that it's going to be hard to stop the Senate from wanting to vote on anything that the House is voting on, and vice versa.
President Freiberg.
No, thank you. That answers my question. I mean, it says to me there's no constitutional barrier to adopting a system like what Representative Lislagard is suggesting, where one chamber essentially can sign off on the governor's executive order, and then if that happens, it will stay in effect. Because I mean, essentially what Representative Haley and Representative Daudt are proposing is that either chamber essentially can have veto authority over the governor's executive authority. So if the Senate, if the Senate votes, unless both chambers agree to it, it'll stop being in effect either immediately under Representative Daudt's proposal or after a certain passage of time under Representative Haley's proposal. So essentially you're giving one chamber authority under their proposal anyway. And in that case, it's veto authority under the Lislagard proposal, which I think is more workable potentially, that you would just give them affirmative authority to approve it. So I don't know. I think he has an intriguing idea. It certainly sounds like there's no constitutional barrier to it, and I'd be glad to work with him to develop it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, members, I don't see any more questions on Representative Daudt's proposal. Oh, wait, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. So let me just put this into context of the state of Minnesota. There has never been a time in our state history since we have had political divisions, as in Republican, Democrat, Independent, that a Republican party has controlled the House, the Senate, and the governor. So we are trying to have some equal footing That is what these two proposals are. For 44 years straight, the Senate was controlled by by Democrats. It's only been recently that Republicans have controlled the Senate. Now, the House, as you know, has flipped back and forth. The governor has kind of flipped back and forth. We had Jesse Ventura, we've had Pawlenty, we've had Dayton and Walz, just in the recent history. But what the problem with that is what you all, the last couple representatives that just spoke, were advocating for is to give the most power to the party that controls the most. And the minority party has very little voice. Historically, again, I just said Republicans have not controlled the House, the Senate, and the governor's offices ever. And we're just trying to have an equal voice. Right now, we have no voice. And I know someone had said, maybe it was Representative Pinto, something about, well, we can do the legislative process now. Yeah, when Republicans agree with Democrats, because a bill, if we're going to do a bill, has to pass the House and the Senate and get signed by the governor, the very governor who has emergency powers. So let's just be real about what we're talking about. We're trying to bring a balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch under this historical understanding that Democrats have had control of one of those bodies for the entire history that we have had political parties. So of course, if you're in the party that's always had control, you want to continue to have control. What we're trying to say is all of the constituents that we are representing would like their voices to be heard. And the things that we believe are controversial, we would like to actually be able to stop them. And we have no ability right now to stop anything of any controversial matter whatsoever, regardless of what it is. If we don't agree with Democrats, it stays in place. That is an unfair field. Our constituents have no voice right now. Only if our voice agrees with the party that is in control. So there may be a semblance of sort of power within the legislature, but essentially the minority party, i.e. the Republican Party, has very little power. And I have a problem with that. My constituents have a problem with that. I think there's a whole lot of constituents in the state of Minnesota that have a problem with that. If we don't agree with the party in control, the controversial issue stands. That's really at issue here. We are trying to bring a balance back to the legislature that is one side controlled by Republicans, one side controlled by Democrats. We're trying to have a balance of power. Right now, there is none. Thank you.
Representative Lizagard, I'm going to go to you, but Representative Baker has guests, so I would like to get to Representative Baker and his proposal. Representative Lizagard.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just really quick, let's not forget where this conversation started. Representative Haley brought forward a bill that I agreed with the concept. And then it came to, I asked the question, is there any executive orders that saved lives? She gave us an example, and that example was telecommunication. It saved lives. Should it continue? Yes, it probably should continue. Then putting into practice what her bill would do would put everything 134 of us agreeing to going to the Senate, and they would have to take it up. She corrected that, but then they could vote it down. So I agree with her bill. The amendment that I'm saying is to protect the people. It's not about Democrat or Republican. It is about protecting the people. And if we agree with something, if not, we're just giving it up. That is the whole point of the amendment, is to let us have that voice. Thank you.
Members, I'm going to go to Representative Baker. He's been waiting patiently. And in your packet, you should have AS025. That's his proposal. Representative Baker, welcome to the committee. And if you want to go over your proposal and Hopefully your testifiers are still with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I think they are, and I appreciate their waiting on as well. I think that all the members have been given a graphic and hopefully a draft of the bill. The bill has not been quite delivered to my office as jacketed as been requested. So that is one issue that we're all kind of waiting on. What I want to propose today, and I'm going to just make a few opening statements. I want to get to my testifiers, and they have very short things to say. And I really want to just get into the committee and talking about why this makes sense or why it doesn't make sense. And I also want to just recognize the work that I've been working behind the scenes on with Representative Sandsteed, Liz Lagarde, Pinto, and others to work on this, Representative Haley, to work on just sort of like, what does this concept look like? So again, I announced it earlier, we need a roadmap to try to help businesses get back on track. We are trying to really focus in on just business restrictions and how they affect people that are not working. We are trying to get people back to work. People are desperately trying to get back to work, but we can't do that until we start opening up and start living here in Minnesota once again. So the details are somewhat on this graph. These details are not anything written in stone, whether we get restaurants opened up at a certain percentage by a certain date, but what it is a plan that we can get together with legislators and have hopefully the governor sign a bill that looks like this, that really in a sense is a olive branch or a gentleman's agreement that says, Governor, hey, will you work with us on this issue? Worst case scenario, he can.
Representative Baker, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Are you trying to put the graph up on your screen?
No, I am not. I assume they had it, Mr. Chair, so I was not trying to put it up. So,
right.
and if the CA wants to put it up, he's more than welcome to do that. I don't know, but I just wanted to make sure that this idea was something that I think we've got to find a pathway to do this. What happened today is not something that I was happy about with the governor announcing.
I apologize for interrupting you again. Mr. Worth or Mr. Blauvelt, do you have his graph handy? Perhaps if you put it up while he was talking, it would be advantageous.
Mr. Chair, I'll work on putting it up right now.
All right. Why don't you continue, Representative Baker, and then it'll go up and you can just continue talking.
And thank you. And we can go back to that too as well. But I think what happened today with the governor's announcement, unbeknownst to really anyone, the industry wasn't told, certainly representatives, at least on my end, have not been told about any tweaks to his dials. Some movement is good. I would say that I would have done some things different, and I want to explain to this committee why that is and why I think that our voices need to be heard so that we can actually have a better outcome for some of these things. So what you're looking at is basically, if a bill was passed today, this is where I would move some of those dials, if we will, the items in the black box. Then again, we've got 30 to 45 days. We can take another step. And then hopefully by May 1st, which is my ultimate goal, we can actually have the state looking like it's basically back to 100% normal opportunities. All of this being said, we've got to look at some dials that make a health decision. And again, some of our members, I mentioned earlier, we were on the call last night for quite a while with the Minnesota Department of Health, and we learned about some of the very important items that they are watching closely. And we can get to that after my testifiers. And again, I'm looking at this concept. I want help drafting this bill with Democrat support. I want ideas, but I am disappointed that we were not included at all in the decisions that were made yesterday or this week about opening up. And I think right now, with numbers being as low as they are, we can move a little quicker on some areas. And I think that our businesses deserve that because they have totally stepped up and done a great job. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn it over to, if you could, turn it over to Ms. Raymer from Hospitality Minnesota.
All right, Liz Raymer, welcome to the committee, and please identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Liz Raymer, I'm President and CEO of Hospitality Minnesota.
Go proceed.
Thank you. Well, throughout the pandemic, we in the hospitality industry have lost 116,000 jobs. And really, that is in normal times a 300,000 person job industry in our state, or 1 in 10 jobs. And the survey that Hospitality Minnesota fielded in December with Explore Minnesota Tourism and the Federal Reserve Bank found that 30% of hotels would face closure in the next quarter, moving to 60% by the time June rolls around, and restaurants up to 50% facing of this year if everything stayed the same. So no other industry has been devastated as much by the pandemic than the hospitality industry. And our experts are predicting a very long multi-year recovery that will stretch well into 2024. With the unemployed workers struggling to hang on, there's urgency to get people back to work. And the quickest way to do this is to turn the dials forward so that these small businesses are allowed to operate at greater capacity. Well, the governor's announcement today provides some welcome news of modest moves forward and loosening restrictions for some of these businesses. It does not lessen the need to craft more comprehensive framework for methodically moving our businesses forward, especially if the virus-related health numbers continue to show improvement. The roadmap that's been forwarded, or that you saw just now, is reasonable. We think it's a balanced concept outlining a phased approach with clear guideposts for decision-making. And because of the labor issue and supply chain issue, logistics that are involved, hospitality businesses must be able to plan for changes in advance to their operations. As you might imagine, it takes time to recall furloughed workers, bring them back in, retrain them with all the safety protocols. And so operators really need a line of sight for when they can put those hiring plans back into place. And very importantly, we need to signal to the market that Minnesota has a plan. We have a plan to move forward so that we're not losing business to other states, especially since our events and tourism areas drive billions of dollars of economic activity in our state. The roadmap proposal expresses really what the hospitality industry has been asking from the administration for many months. And that is that we need a plan with metrics and goals so that businesses are able to link this to their business plan to operate as successfully as possible, given the ongoing unpredictability of the pandemic. We certainly understand that there is no straight line, but unless Minnesota has a plan to point to for decision-making, our businesses will be left with no tools to secure the future and will instead continue to export businesses to states that do have a plan. So the roadmap is offered and builds flexibility to accommodate those if-then indicators to reflect health data and changing conditions, while it still provides longer-term guideposts for the hospitality industry for decision-making. In this way, the roadmap charts a clear and a simple plan so that businesses can have some certainty of the pathway for increasing capacity for their operations. And really, at the end of the day, all of us should be able to come together to set forth a reasonable, tangible plan with goals that can move our state forward in a safe and purposeful manner. And after all, success doesn't just happen, it's planned for. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members, are there any questions from the committee? I don't see any, so we'll go to the next testifier. Ken Jarka, welcome to the committee, and please identify yourself for the record.
Yes, thank you for having me today. My name is Ken Jarka. I'm the general manager at the Hilton Minneapolis. I'm also the president of the Greater Minneapolis Hotel Association. You know, the Hilton Minneapolis is the largest hotel in Minnesota. We had to lay off close to 500 employees. We are currently operating the hotel with 28 employees today. We've been dealing with this economic hardship that's been compounded with the civil unrest, safety concerns, and the executive order that has limited the size of groups and crippled the operation, with revenues down at 79% year over year at just my property alone. The Minneapolis downtown hotels, however, revenue has dropped from $354 million to $74 million year over year. That's a 79% drop. If you back out January and February, as those were pre-COVID months, it's an 89% drop. We continue to lose business because of the restraints that the executive order has put on this industry. We have groups canceling as far out as October and November of this year and taking their business elsewhere because other states have loosened their restrictions and they have a next phase plan in place where the state of Minnesota does not. We had a citywide volleyball tournament for 2 weeks in May that just canceled and went to Omaha because they have a plan in place. I have multiple local companies who just canceled their groups for April and August. We're trying to rebook them for 2022, and they're just not comfortable booking because the state of Minnesota haven't put a plan together. So they're looking elsewhere as well. Group contacts are telling us they don't feel confident in booking in Minnesota because we don't have a next phase plan, as so many other states do. My hotel has and continues to operate around 2 to 8% in occupancy since the executive order has been put in place. When we have group business at the Hilton Minneapolis, we are an economic engine that other hotels feed off of from the compression. But 50% of the local restaurants get their business from these groups, as does other local establishments. My hotel alone pays $4.2 million in property taxes, and we have received no financial aid. And yet we are the industry that has been impacted the most from this pandemic and this executive order. The executive order that was presented today is a step in the right direction, but the state needs to turn the dials further and agree to a phased plan to build public confidence so that we can have our employees return to work. We are looking for a phased plan spelling out how we're going to open so that we don't see any of the groups leaving Minnesota, but rather bringing group business and jobs back to Minnesota. Thank you.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the testifier. You know, one of the excuses we hear is that the pandemic drives these things. So since we don't know how the pandemic is going to be in 3 months, we can't make a plan for what's going to happen in 3 months. So, you know, we've seen this not only with what you mentioned, but also with weddings that are in youth athletic tournaments. We're seeing a lot of business not stop, but just leave the state of Minnesota. What resources are these states deploying that they have access to that Minnesota is somehow not able to respond to? What is there a limitation? Like, is Nebraska just that much more smart than us? What is it? What resources do they have that we don't, that allows them to plan in a way that we can't?
Mr. Jarka or Ms. Raymer, I'm not sure which one wants. Mr. Jarka, you wish to respond?
What we're hearing is it's just a matter of having a plan put in place, phasing it in. We understand that it's not going to be written in stone, but what our meeting planners need, and in order to feel comfortable, is some type of plan spelling out over the next course of the next few months or the remainder of the year what it could look like moving forward. Right now, we're at the mercy of the governor to make an announcement at his whim, and then we have to then scramble, and whether or not it's in favor of the group that's coming, or we're going to have to cancel the group. So right now, the meeting planners just don't feel comfortable using that type of plan. So they're more apt to go to states that actually have spelled out what the plan, what it could look like if the pandemic continues its course, or it could, if things do pick up and go the opposite direction, we'll just, pivot and turn. But it actually gives a lot of these meeting planners a peace of mind in order to book.
Ms. Raymer, you wish to respond?
Yeah, I would just add to that too. Having a plan is really important, especially for these larger events, tourism and the like, really look to those things. And it enables the conversation and negotiations to continue. And for so many of these events, they book way out into the future. And as Mr. Jarko was saying, they need some confidence that there is going to be more certainty that they'll be able to have their event in a city or a state that has a plan. And so, again, this is a distinction that Minnesota, to be a leader, should have. And again, we're indicating that this should have flexibility. There should be metrics in place that can be dialed up or back depending on the situation. As I stated, we recognize it's not a clear, certain straight line. It's been twists and turns every stretch of the way with this pandemic. We get that. And yet we need to have some guideposts so that these business operators can have a business plan and look to that for some idea of how to bring back workers and plan for a summer season in the case of resorts and so on and so forth. So that's really critical, is having some key guideposts and metrics to shoot for.
Chairman, if I could just...
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to either of the testifiers, again, thank you for your testimony, but play for me devil's advocate here, okay? What possible Minnesota have for saying that we are only going to release plans after the fact? Right? Because right now, that's what we're doing right now is we say, well, we don't know where the pandemic's going to be in a couple of weeks. We don't know where things are going to be in a month. We can't offer you any sort of plan, even though there's many other jurisdictions and other states, as you testified, that are doing that. Play devil's advocate for me. Why is the state of Minnesota, what would be the defense of the state of Minnesota only responding to the pandemic in terms of opening things up, as opposed to being proactive and laying out a plan?
Representative Garofalo, who are you aiming the question at?
For either of the testifiers, Mr. Chairman, I'm asking the testifiers, they work in hospitality, they have subject matter expertise. Play devil's advocate for me and tell me, like, what are the benefits to being reactive instead of planning? Why are we one of the few places that are, there must be some reason besides incompetence that the state of Minnesota is doing it this way.
Mr. Jarka, I'll go to you first.
This has been extremely frustrating since this pandemic has started. I don't know why Minnesota is not putting a plan in place. It's a course of action for us, and I'm baffled. And I can't play devil's advocate because I don't understand why the governor is not, putting a plan in place so that we can at least communicate to our employees, to our groups, contacts, and so forth, how we're going to open the state. It's not just about hospitality. You're dealing with other industries out there that are also wondering what is it going to take to open this state. So we just need to kind of figure out, maybe we need to learn, like you said, maybe we do need to learn from the surrounding states and figure out why they're able to roll out a plan of action, and yet we can't. I don't understand. Maybe Liz can chime in a little bit here.
Ms. Raymer.
Yes, and I think the important thing too to keep in mind is the unemployed workers that I mentioned. They are looking to their employers and saying, when am I going to have a job back? And they don't want to be on the state of Minnesota unemployment payroll. They want to be working and productive. And so there really is a benefit, again, to be laying a course of action. Again, if you start on a trip and you don't have a roadmap or don't know where you're going, you might get somewhere, but who knows where. And so, again, we're just asking that there be some guideposts that we can all look to as markers for taking the next step. It doesn't mean we would maybe not have to go backwards if things, go upside down again. But if you don't have a plan, you won't get to someplace you want to get to ultimately. It won't be successful. And these business operators, they have a business plan to be able to be successful. And that's what we need here with our state as well.
Chairman, if I could ask my final question.
I didn't hear that, Representative Garofalo.
Oh, I have one final question.
All right, Representative Garofalo.
So either of the testifiers, again, the excuse you've heard is that because we don't know where the virus is going to be in a month, we can't plan for what's going to happen in a month. Do either of you have a response for that?
Mr. Jarka?
Nobody knows where it's going to be. It's like throwing, we just don't know where it's going to be, but that doesn't mean we can't plan for the best and be able to move forward. All these companies, all these hotels, we have budgets that we have to also adhere to. Like Liz said, we have all these employees that are trying to, get back to work. It's my responsibility as a general manager to get these 500 employees back to work. And we need to have a plan put in place so that I can achieve that. And right now, the governor's holding my hands and we're not able to work and figure this out. I'm on a call once a week with Commissioner Grove. And I've been on a call once a week with him and his committee since this pandemic has started regarding large venues. We've thrown ideas out there. What is it going to take to open up? The Hilton Minneapolis has partnered with the Mayo Clinic, Lysol. We have systems in place, as well as every other hotel company out there. And yet, every idea that we have given to the commissioner, it has fallen on deaf ears. So I guess the question is, what is it going to take for us to put a plan together so that we can actually feel comfortable opening? Again, it's not something that's going to be written in stone, but at least it gives us some path moving forward, which is better than what we actually have today.
Ms. Raymer, I'll let you respond too.
Yeah, and again, I would agree. You know, we have been in many conversations, and again, this concept that you saw that Representative Baker showed you is just that. It's a design. This is meant to be a collaborative effort to agree on what are the metrics that make some sense to say if our numbers continue to trend in this manner and we reach this certain point, then we will be able to do this. And if they go another direction, then we'll be able to do that. And I think that's really what we're looking for, is for people to look at that and go, oh, and they can see every day what's happening with the pandemic, with the numbers that are reported by the Department of Health, and they can make some judgments as to how to plan their business. That's really what we're asking for here.
Representative Garofalo, Assistant Commissioner Huff has been with us for the entire hearing. Do you want me to go to him and try to respond to your question? Representative Garofalo?
Mr. Chair, Baker here, if I could maybe kind of respond to that.
Representative Baker.
Thank you. So I think what Representative Garofalo is trying to get to is what are the resources that maybe other states have that we don't have? And I don't think it's resources. I think what honestly it is, it's a matter of policy, and it's actually a matter of trust that the executive branch has with our business owners. I will tell you that Ken Jarka will lose his job if he doesn't take care of that volleyball tournament that could very likely have come to Minnesota. I just know that he would have taken every step necessary to make sure that everything in his property, his operation would have been handled properly. And I think it's a matter of some states have more of a moral opening to providing better judgments to their business owners because they have so much to lose. And to not have that ability to be offered up to that service, I think is what we're really at here today, members. It's my discussion last night with the Department of Health. And I think the big aha moment for me was we can analyze these numbers to death. We can find out which numbers you really want to dive into. But when we all find that right balance, whether it's low 7-day percentages or the high rate of the testing going on, it comes down to it honestly just comes down to a moral decision that we as legislators have to make. Because it'll never be perfect and nobody will ever totally agree. But we've got to get to a point where we can start planning something with the ability to trust and to believe in our business operators. After 11 months of this, I would never have said this 90 days after the announcement back in March, but 11 months later, Ken Jarka and folks like him get this, and they have too much to lose if they don't do it right. So I just would love that opportunity to be able to show the rest of the nation Minnesota can be open for business better and more openly, because we do know our businesses are absolutely ready to step in. And I think that's what we're kind of missing here, because that's going to be a big part of this conversation. Mr. Chair, I'm done.
Representative Moran. Representative Moran.
Thank you, Chair Pulaski. Before I ask a question, do you think that it would be okay to open it up to have the commissioner to respond to Ms. Rammer and Mr. Kinjarka? Because I would like to hear what he thinks about this process too.
We could have Assistant Commissioner Huff respond. I think the response would be to both of our testifiers and to Representative Garofalo, because I think the question is framed to them, and then we could have him respond to the idea: is there a plan, or what would be a plan to be put in place? So, Assistant Commissioner Huff, to the question.
And then I would like to respond. Thank you.
And we'll keep you on the list.
Yes, thank you.
Assistant Commissioner, welcome to the committee, and please identify yourself for the record.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dan Huff, and I'm an Assistant Commissioner with the Minnesota Department of Health. Representative Moran and Mr. Chair, first of all, I very much appreciate Mr. Jakarta and Ms. Raymer being here today. We've had many conversations over the last many months. I'd like to say first that we do take very seriously the input that you provide. I'm You know, as you both know, I'm often on those weekly calls that Commissioner Grove leads to provide an update on where we are from our health measures. Early on in the pandemic, we published our public health risk scores. We originally called them dial-back scores, and then we changed the name to public health risk scores, but they've been the same thing. They're on our website. These are the scores that and the measures that we have gone over, you know, and just shown what's the trajectory of the pandemic. We have a caution threshold. We have a green threshold. We have a caution threshold and a high risk threshold. Can you hear me okay, Representative O'Neill?
I think she can hear you. I think she's asking you to
speed it up a little bit. We still have conversation to have.
Okay.
All right. Apologize, but proceed.
I want to make sure I'm answering the question specifically. So I would say that we have looked very carefully at what other states have done, what plans they have had. And we found that almost all the states that had, say, set plans, if you hit this number, then Y happens, or if you hit this number, then X happens. They, throughout the pandemic, early on, just discarded those plans. And I think what we have seen is the public health risk scores, if we were to follow only them, we would have been much more closed. The economy would have been much more closed than if we had taken more of a flexible and balanced approach, which the governor has chosen to really take into that Venn diagram that I shared, I think, a couple weeks ago in my presentation, which really had, you know, we look at the economic health, we look at the well-being, people well-being, as well as the public health risk scores. It's that nuance of all three of those. And that has allowed the governor to provide tweaks, especially as we have learned more. In the beginning of the pandemic hit a couple of settings really hard. It hit our long-term care facilities, and it hit our meat packing plants. We then responded, you know, you will recall the governor's 5-point battle plan on long-term care. We had a similar plan, although less publicized, working with meat packing that implemented particular mitigation strategies in those settings. As a result of implementing those, cases went way down in those settings. As the spread became more common within the community, and it wasn't in one particular setting, we then shifted our mitigation strategies to look more closely at what are those areas that are fueling the spread. And unfortunately for the businesses impacted, it was the hospitality industry. It's where people come and gather, they mix from different households. They are often eating or drinking, which means that they don't have a mask on. They're socializing with each other, so they're talking, they're kind of close. And we know that as people drink, their ability to self-control goes down. We found that statewide, we have some people who did an excellent job and of no fault to them, just the fact of the disease, and it's highly contagious, the disease spread within their setting. And that is why the mitigation measures became more targeted. It's why retail does not have the same restrictions as a bar or restaurant. It's not that it can't spread in retail. It definitely can. But we have found that the conditions under a bar or restaurant spread much more likely. And our evidence shows that, the scientific research shows that. So over time, we have adjusted the mitigation strategies to target where the spread is happening, always based upon that Venn diagram, looking at those public health risk scores that have published daily updates on our website, as well as looking at the economic impact, our own just social well-being, and always listening to both the industry, but also we listen to doctors and ER nurses and our own epidemiologists, taking all of that together. All of our public health data, the same data that we present to the governor, is all on our website. It's all published. It's all, and whenever we receive requests from the legislature, we try to be as responsive as possible, to the media responsive as possible. So I heard earlier some concerns about transparency. You know, I feel we at Minnesota Department of Health has been as transparent as we can in providing the data so that it's accessible for everyone. Thank you.
All right, Representative Moran. And members, we're down to the last 5 minutes. We're not going to get to Representative Sandstead today. She will be up first, or we'll be finishing Representative Baker. If he has a bill introduced, certainly we may want to frame conversations around a bill that's been introduced. So Representative Moran.
Thank you, Assistant Commissioner Huff. He says a lot that I wanted to say, but I think it's really important that we follow the science. No one, and I understand the hospitality, how you feel about your business, but the governor is not the enemy here. It is the virus. It is the virus that has came in and has caused us to protect one another. It is the virus himself, you know, and as I look at Baker's bill here that has these arbitrary dates around 30 days after final enactment, you know, the bars and the restaurant can operate manually, 60 days after the final enactment, you know, businesses will begin to operate normally. That has been the problem, that we continue to not see the virus and do what the science is telling us to do, and then it just seems to explode. We are so close. We are so close to getting to a place where I cannot wait to go out and have a great evening. I cannot wait to go into a hotel and spend a good week or so or two. That is what I want to do. But we have to get this virus under control. And it's going to take the hospitality industry and all of us to be a part of working towards that end. And so I won't say too much, but it is important to me. I am as frustrated as anyone else, but it is the virus. And there's a new strain, just so that we know that. There's a new strain. And we, as Representative Garofalo stated, we do not know where the virus will be. So we cannot plan 30 days out. We cannot plan 60 days out. We cannot, because it is controlling us. We are not controlling it. And I will stop with that.
Representative O'Neill.
I see Lead Daudt is back, so I'm going to yield my time to him because we're almost out of time.
Representative O'Neill, I've got other members before him. Representative Pinto.
And given the time, I'll defer to Lead Daudt as well, Mr. Chair.
All right, I'll go to Representative Daudt. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to catch you before the end of this hearing. I think I really appreciate the conversation we're having. I feel like we're just now, last week and this week, kind of getting to the meat of what we need to accomplish. I'm actually very eager to hear the testimony and hear about Representative Sandstead's bills. And I don't really want to wait another week to do that. Is there a way that we can request to have a hearing, maybe an evening next week, Monday or Tuesday evening, so that we can continue this business without it just being another week now?
Representative Daudt, I was going to make that request too, because I think we're collecting enough data now where we can begin to move forward. Representative Lizagard is also coming with a request, and I think we'll see some refinement with Representative Sandstead's proposals too, and perhaps with Representative Baker too once the bill is introduced. I was going to make that request too, because a week is just getting to be too much time.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll make the request.
Appreciate it.
Members, we're technically out of time. I want to thank you particularly to the testifiers and for everyone's patience. And with that, meeting is adjourned.